Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Beyond the Code. Today, I'm joined by SEC Commissioner Hester Peirce, affectionately called Cryptomom within the cryptoverse. Commissioner Peirce is one of 5 commissioners who sits on the SEC, and she's been a voice of reason in an SEC that's been increasingly hostile towards the crypto community and towards innovation generally over the past few years. She was personally appointed by President Trump during his previous term, and I'm extremely proud and excited to have her with us on today's episode.
Welcome to Beyond the Code, the podcast where industry experts and brilliant legal minds discuss the impact of new emerging technologies. I'm your host, Yitzy, a lawyer and tech enthusiast. Join us as we explore the legal, regulatory, and ethical issues surrounding AI, blockchain, and more. Get ready to go beyond the code and stay ahead of the game. Commissioner Peirce, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate this. I will just start by stating that I'm pretty well versed in U.S. securities laws related issues, but I'm by no means a securities lawyer, so please excuse my ignorance in some fields. I am, however, a huge fan of yours and have been for years. And for actually getting into the podcast, I just want to say thank you for joining me and thank you for being a voice of reason these past few years for the crypto industry and for innovation generally.
Well, thanks, Yitzy, for those kind words. It's great to be with you. I want to give you my disclaimer, of course, which is that my views are my own views as a commissioner, not necessarily those of the SEC or my fellow commissioners. And second disclaimer, I'm a little bit under the weather, so I apologize for that.
Well, we excuse you on being under the weather, and I'm glad that your views are your own. I've heard you speak much and often over the years, and I love how refreshing and clear your approach always is. So thank you again for joining me. I guess we'll start off by asking what to me has been kind of something that I've always thought about. Again, you were an SEC staffer and you've been a commissioner for quite some time. I think you've probably spent a large portion of your career in the SEC, and you must have like a pride towards the commission and towards the organization at large. You're also over much of that time been a dissenting voice, and the commission has been seen as kind of like a big bad wolf, at least in the crypto space, but on other fronts as well. And I wonder as to how you resonate with that dissonance, as on one hand, like being part of an organization that you believe in and want very much to see succeed and fulfill its mission, and on the other hand, the commission being seen as this kind of like a stumbling block towards innovation and not necessarily meeting what its initial goals are supposed to be.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question because it kind of highlights where the mixed feelings that I've felt now for the past 7 years. I was at the commission before, as you mentioned. I've had a long history with the commission. I started there as a junior lawyer, spent 8 years there, and then left and came back as a commissioner in 2018. And part of the reason that I wanted to come back as a commissioner, not something that I had thought about doing before, but when I was presented with the opportunity of doing it, I thought, this is a chance for me to really affect the agency in a way that I think is so important for it to be able to continue to contribute to the health and safety and soundness of the capital markets in the United States over the long term. And that is really to think about how the agency approaches innovation and think about how it approaches its role as a regulator in balancing its objectives. Our objectives are protecting investors, of course, facilitating capital formation and fostering fair, orderly, and efficient markets. And so too often we have taken the position that although we're not a merit regulator, Congress didn't tell us to be a merit regulator, we've taken a position that has, in effect, turned us into a merit regulator. And that manifests itself in different ways, but one of the ways is really having a difficulty accepting new developments and new competitors. And that really came to a head with respect to crypto, because you got this whole set of potential new entrants in the industry in the financial services industry, who were coming from outside of financial services. And so we're really viewing things through a new lens. And so how do you deal with all that change coming from people you're not used to dealing with? And so I think that's really where I have felt that tension, because I want us to be able to be more nimble, and I want us to be more open to letting new competitors come in. Again, not saying to them, we're going to roll out the red carpet for you, but we're going to let you compete on the same terms as everyone else. And then we're going to let the market figure out whether they want you or not. And so that's the role that I think I can play, is to say, is to push the agency to be a little bit more willing to engage with new technologies, new competitors. And we've got a lot of great talent at the agency, a lot of great legal minds and economists and accountants. And so really what it requires is having the commission, right? I said at the outset that I only speak for myself. There's a commission of 5 commissioners. And so the message coming from the 5 of us needs to be, we want you to engage with these new technologies and new competitors. And that's something that I feel like in my role, I can at least bring that voice to say, hey, we're not doing this. We're not going about this the right way. And maybe we can get a culture change now that we have a new administration coming in. Maybe we can get a culture change coming from the top, again, because the staff has to do whatever the commission says. So the staff isn't really free to do its own thing.
So the staff, I understand, has to follow whatever the commission says, but what's the dynamic between, and again, excuse my ignorance, between the 5 commissioner or the 4 commissioners and the chair?
Yeah, that's a good question. The SEC is an unusual agency in that it does have five person head, essentially. And so it's a politically balanced, you can't have more than 3 from the president's party. Mm-hmm. The chairman has more authority than the other commissioners. So he sets the budget, the staff report to him, and he sets the agenda. So obviously that's a lot, right? And so the chair is going to set the direction of the commission. And so when you have a chairman who has really strong views on something like crypto, that is going to have an outsized effect. And so if I had been able to convince 2 of my colleagues to go along with me on some of these things, we could have made progress, but you would still end up with the difficulty that the agenda is still being set by someone who, isn't necessarily on the same page.
I understand. Do you think that the failure to provide guidelines or the hesitation to be at the forefront of these innovative developments of technology comes from a fear or a lack of understanding of what they actually are and what they mean, or something more than that?
I can't speak for other people, but what I can say is that there's a natural regulatory tendency to say, no, why should we let something new happen? Because if something goes wrong, people are going to come blame us. And if something goes right, people are not going to come and thank us. And so there's this real, really understandable conservatism to say, we know we've dealt with this set of large financial firms for a long time. We're very familiar with them. We have dealt with this set of rules and products for a long time. So when someone comes in and says, hey, we want you to change stuff, we're going to say, let's just slow walk this a little bit. And it's not only in crypto that this comes up. We've seen this in the past. For example, we tend to be very focused on larger public companies when we're thinking about rules. And so smaller companies that are trying to raise capital have often had difficulty because it's disproportionately more expensive for them to raise capital.
Yeah, sure.
And so there are adjustments. Congress gave us the power to adjust the rules to make it even out the burden a little bit, make it less disproportionately expensive for these smaller companies, make it feasible for them to raise capital. And it's something that we've not been great about over time. And so Congress has had to come in through something like the Jobs Act and say, SEC, use the power that we gave you. And we're going to be much more, directive here because you haven't done it on your own. And we're going to tell you what we want you to do, but you could have done this on your own. And so I think that we're seeing a similar thing happening with crypto, which is really, there's not really an upside to working with these people. And then add on top of that the fact that, as we all know, as anyone who's followed crypto knows, there's a lot of bad activity in the name of crypto. Some of it is just outright frauds that are just, wearing a crypto label because that's the trendy thing to do. But some of it is people who are really crypto people who are doing things that are not great. So my counter to that is, hey, you know what? It'd be easier for people to distinguish the good actors from the bad actors if you actually made the rules clear so that the people who wanted to comply could go ahead and comply. And then
I believe that's the mission statement of the SEC, right? The whole idea is to protect U.S. consumers, but by not providing guidelines, all of these crypto companies, some of them are scams, have to find other ways to get to U.S. consumers without registering with the SEC, be it going offshore or using VPNs or whatever it is. And in the end of the day, the U.S. consumer is exposed to these scams and even if they're not scams, they're just not having the appropriate regulatory controls that you would have had if you would have gone through some kind of registration process and oversight. So,
and I think that's the part of the analysis that really has been missing from us, right? Which is that, these entities are going to go do their thing overseas and they're going to reach U.S. investors or U.S. customers. Whether or not they're investors is a question, but they're going to reach U.S. customers. And then something's going to go wrong. And those US customers are going to come to us at the SEC and say, hey, why didn't you protect me from this company? And we're going to say, and legitimately so, well, the company was outside our jurisdiction. But the whole point is that these companies want to set up and do business here. And so why not let them do that?
Just tell them how to do that.
Yeah, then we'll have a more direct ability to prevent things from going wrong in the first place and then go in afterwards if things do go wrong.
Right. Okay, thank you. That was very helpful. So I know that Chair Gensler is stepping down and Paul Atkins is coming back to the SEC, and there's kind of going to be a shuffle both within the commission and within the new administration, with a crypto czar coming in from somebody who's a big whose entire livelihood is based off of this space, and especially excited about these new developments in North America in particular. I think that great things are coming. What do you think? Well, what's the state of the SEC right now, and what can we anticipate in the coming months?
I mean, the SEC is still for another week is as it has been.
The same SEC.
Right. So.
Well, I guess what happens to existing enforcement actions that may have been seen as frivolous when Commissioner or Chair Atkins comes in? Could he just put a halt to things that he doesn't necessarily agree with?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's...
Is there a complete shuffle of the agenda? How does that work?
Yeah, well, again, I mean, the agenda is his to set. So Chairman Atkins comes in, he decides what to do. But there are a couple of, I guess, cautionary notes. One is Chairman Atkins is going to have a lot of things on his plate, and crypto will be one of those things, but it will not be the only thing by any means. The second point is that enforcement actions that are already authorized by the commission. So when we bring in enforcement action, what happens is the staff comes to us with a recommendation, and often that recommendation will be to sue someone and to settle at the same time. The case is then pretty much done. But what can happen, obviously, is that we can sue and someone doesn't settle. And so when we authorize the staff to go ahead and sue, that lawsuit starts, and we have a bunch of those lawsuits in the crypto space that are ongoing. And so if the commission authorized it, it's not so easy to just,
renege on that.
They're there. So I think, those will be questions that we'll have to think about as a commission, and there will be activity. My prediction is there will be activity on the side of which is what I've called for, which is let's do some proactive, productive things here. Let's talk to people about how can we allow projects to move forward that are clearly not within our space and just carve those out of our space altogether. Whether Congress wants to set up some other regulatory regime or whether some other regulatory regime already covers those things, that's another question. And then there's the space of things that are within our remit, but where some kind of exemptive relief is necessary. And so we'll be able to work on some of those kinds of things as well. And we'll be able to do that with the input of the public, because I think it's so important to do this in a way that involves lots of people. Transparent, exactly. It's very different than how things have been done. And so I think those processes are going to be moving on, and then we can try to figure out how that interacts with other things that the commission is doing. These things take time, and I think that's the other cautionary note. People need to know that things take time to change. So some of the decisions,
it's not going to be overnight.
What's that?
It's not going to be overnight.
It's not overnight. And some of the decisions that are made under this commission now can make life very hard for the next commission.
Well, I was going to say I'm optimistic, but now that seems like an unfortunate way to end things.
No, and I don't mean to not be optimistic, because I think this is a moment where we can we've all been complaining. I've been complaining. A lot of people in the crypto world have been complaining, and rightfully so. Now's the time for us to say, okay, now what do we want? Like, what do we want this to look like? What do we want this regulatory regime to look like? What makes sense? I've put out some ideas in the past. Other people have put out some ideas. Which of these ideas is best? Are there other ideas? I want to have some roundtables where we bring together different people in the same forum to really bounce ideas back and forth. We're not going to get this perfect, but the benefit that we have is that some other jurisdictions have been much faster. What has worked from those jurisdictions and what hasn't? We have a different statutory framework, so we may not be able to port over things from other jurisdictions entirely, but are there elements of those things that we can take and put into place here? So yeah, I don't want you not to be optimistic, but I want you to channel that optimism into constructive idea, and not you specifically. I'm not putting it all on you, but
I'll take
your listeners, right? I want them to think about, what does this actually look like if it's going to be successful, and then send me those ideas.
So I mentioned before how, I guess in a sense, I was disappointed with the SEC's failure to provide guidance, in the sense that it way-sided U.S. consumers. But I would take it even a step further as somebody who lives now abroad. I live in Israel, and the regulators here very much look to the U.S. as like a beacon of light. And they've been sitting on the fence for quite some time, still have not come forth with clear regulations, at least in the Securities Authority. And in that sense, the U.S. and the SEC in particular has done a disservice to residents abroad as well, whose regulators are kind of still waiting for the SEC to come out and say, okay, this is how we're going to do it. And then everybody else will just say, okay, we'll do it like the SEC did. So I guess what I want to ask you is, how does the SEC or does it even work with securities organizations abroad? Is there any kind of coordination or formal education process that it goes through? That's on the education and rulemaking side. And on the enforcement side, does the SEC try and enforce regulations on companies or projects that are based overseas? And what limits, if any, does the SEC set on its reach in enforcement cases outside of the US?
Yeah, both good questions. And I think it is really important I've heard this from other people as well. Like, hey, we want to know what the SEC is going to do in this area. While we may not copy exactly, it'll be informative to us. And I think we have really dropped the ball here, where we could have set a better example and tried to adopt some principles-based regulations that would work well here and would be easy to mesh with other international regulations. We do spend quite a bit of effort working with foreign securities regulators, both in coordinating on enforcement, for example, and talking about problems that we face in common and how we're addressing those problems, and then in educating and telling them what's worked here in the US, that we work often with companies that are just developing securities markets and working with them to sort of understand what a good regulatory framework looks like within which a healthy securities market can thrive. And then in terms of, our extraterritorial reach, we often do read our extraterritorial reach quite broadly. Sometimes, in my view, too broadly. I mean, we have limited resources, and so we have to think about, where do we want to spend them? And when most of the activity has been outside the United States, to me, it's not that interesting. I think I shouldn't say not that interesting, but it's just not the highest priority demand on our resources.
Sure.
If you as a US citizen decide to avail yourself of a market in a different country, more power to you.
It's on you.
But like, you're opting out of the securities law system in the United States. And so when something goes wrong, don't come running to me, is my view. We have other things to do with those resources. But that's not always how my colleagues interpret things. Sometimes the commission is much more willing to reach in order to be able to pull something into our jurisdiction.
Okay. So I've heard you say...
one other point that I want to make in connection with international cooperation.
Sure.
So I did put out a suggestion that we try to develop some sort of cross-border experimental regime, like a sandbox regime. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't have to be cross-border, but it was designed so that it could be plug and play. If you get approval in your home country, for example, to do something, then you could come and take that same experiment and run it here in the US on a small scale, limited scale, but using
even
the same
conditions. Even if the controls
conditions
abroad were like substantially less than the controls that you would impose within the US?
Well, you'd have the same. Yeah, it would be, permissive to allow you to do that on different conditions than you do in the US on a limited scale. And then you'd work toward sort of no action relief in the US. At the same time, you're working toward some sort of permanent relief in your home jurisdiction. That's just an idea. But I think that kind of thing could be really helpful in this area where, there's a lot of international work going on.
Okay, I'd like to see that be something that maybe comes to fruition, in the coming months or years. So definitely develop that idea.
I'll keep working on it.
I've heard you say that you can't engage with crypto tools and products directly due to a possible conflict of interest, but you've definitely been exposed to crypto tokens and products over the years on a very deep level. If you got a green light tomorrow to go and buy crypto, what are the three, not so much, no, I'm not saying which are the three blockchain products that you would be most intrigued or excited to interact with from a curiosity perspective?
I mean, I think it's really hard for me.
By the way, I think it's a very important point. Again, it's something that I've heard you mention more than once, because I often tell clients or even more so naysayers over a family or holiday meal or whatever, who are telling me how crypto's a scam. I'll tell them, until you interact with these products directly and until you send Bitcoin from one wallet to another, you can't understand it. You just can't understand it. So I could definitely resonate with what you're saying. So from a learning perspective, something like where you really want to feel that you want to close that gap, what would be the thing that would be most intriguing to you?
Well, I mean, I think that's part of it, right? Sending a crypto asset from one wallet to another. What is it like to set up a wallet to send from one wallet to another? Have that fear of, is it really going to get to the right place? And I think people have had a lot of fun playing around with DeFi protocols and things like that. But again, I say that I have a lot to learn. I would like to learn how to code also. I mean, I'd love to be able to understand it from that perspective. I'm never going to be a developer, but I'd like to be able to understand how that works. I would never tell anyone to engage with this if you don't want to. This is always something where I say, when you're putting money into something, whatever it is, you have to make your own decision. And so whatever decision I might make in terms of educating myself does not say that someone else needs to be doing that same thing. You have to think about, is this something you want to do? And then you've got to educate yourself and figure out if it's even something you have time and energy and interest and the ability to potentially lose the money. I think that's one of the things that does make me sad about this space, is that I think a lot of people just jump in and they think, oh, I'm going to become wealthy because I'm going to play around with crypto.
Get rich quick.
And and that, I always caution people against that. You should have some sort of thesis for what you're doing. If your thesis is, I want to have a learn, okay, but you also have to realize that might come at a price. And so if your thesis is you want to just enjoy, that's fine too. But again, that may come at a price. And so I think we'd do better if we also had some education on the side of people who are in the space, and expectation management maybe is what I would say. And I'm not, I'm sure that your listeners know this already. But I think it is important to say that in the sense that I'm someone who really believes people should be able to make decisions for their own lives. But with that comes responsibility. And so I want to build that framework where we can all make our own decisions. We can all teach ourselves things by trying new things. But if something goes wrong, we also recognize that that's potentially a consequence.
Absolutely. On that point, do you think that in addition to regulating through enforcement and providing guidelines, which ostensibly are the two main areas that the SEC is active in to date, do you think that education should be on the SEC's agenda? In other words, as someone who would be a gatekeeper in a sense to U.S. consumers coming in and engaging with these products, the SEC should produce educational materials as to how they should engage with those products and what the significance is?
It's a good question, because I do think the SEC we have a presence in investor education just generally. And I think it is important for us to be there and have resources that people can go to and they can feel they can get an objective sense of what's going on. We have databases with financial professionals that people can go to, and I think that's great. So you can kind of get that person's history. And we make information available to people, obviously, so they can make their own decisions about things that are securities, right? But at the end of the day, I think there are other sources of education that are really important too. And I would urge people who are excited about getting people involved in crypto or any other industry, educate people objectively. Don't try to lure them in by presenting one side of things. If you present objective information, and this is what I say to people who sell just standard financial products, we are all better off if everyone in that transaction has a clear understanding of what is being bought or sold. And so I think the industry can do a better job at education. I think we can do a better job at education as well. And I think it's a shared responsibility. I mean, we're really, in the United States, we need to get people doing financial literacy training much earlier when they're kids. And that will translate, and that will help them think about all kinds of things, including crypto.
I know that it's not what you had in mind, but like my 14-year-old son, when he had his bar mitzvah last year, so he bought his first Bitcoin.
I know. I heard in a show where you talked about that.
Oh wow.
He's
Oh wow!
Yeah,
I didn't realize that you're a listener.
Yeah,
Wow, I'm flattered. So that was for him like an entry point into just financial literacy generally, and the amount of questions that stem from that initial experience were tremendous. But that came from me. Like there's no formal education in school or in society, unfortunately, that exposes kids at that age to financial literacy and responsibility. And that's unfortunate because they interact with money from a young age. They are exposed to their parents' financial decisions from a young age. And I think that it would be a very, very valuable thing. And again, something that would probably be synonymous with parts of your mission to make those that information available at very early ages, like you said.
Yeah, and so we do try to do some of that. I mean, I spoke to a sixth grade class about these issues, crypto, and I've gone to speak to high school kids, and they're often asking about crypto and other things. But I love your son's intellectual curiosity. I mean, that the fact that he started asking questions as a result of that. And I think that's what we really need to foster in people, is the ability and the courage to ask questions, because we don't know what kinds of opportunities and scams they're going to be presented with in the future. And we want them to be just ready to go and to ask questions and to be skeptical. Absolutely. And to say, I think you're just ripping me off because you're telling me that I've got to buy this today or my opportunity is gone tomorrow. No, I'm not going to take that. I need to get all my questions answered before I'm willing to invest. So cultivating that early in your kid is great. And I want to see parents doing that, schools doing that, and us doing that. So I'm always happy to talk to school kids who are interested in talking to me.
I can't imagine a crypto conference where half of the lecturers are not talking about the SEC and what it's going to be doing next. It would be,
I can't wait.
Very refreshing.
I can't wait till that day.
To come off the agenda.
Yeah.
And And I'm going to take it a step further. I'm waiting for the day where there's going to be an SEC crypto conference. That's going to be an exciting one.
We did have one of those, really. But I think, so I do hope that we'll have some roundtables coming up. And so maybe that's your SEC crypto conference.
But not so much for consumers, perhaps also for other governments and other regulators, global regulators, because like I said, like the regulators in the US are seen as like a beacon of light and, of sense. And so until you guys start spewing that information outside and setting guidelines, we're not going to see it abroad either.
But
I mean, Mika is Mika, but it's not the same.
Yeah, but I think the thing that I worry about sometimes when you just put a bunch of regulators in the room is that they all kind of
feels like
feed
the
each
beginning
other.
of a joke.
And so we do need to think first about how we're doing things here, and then if we find a reasonable framework, we can kind of take that on the international road a bit. But I too cannot wait until the day when nobody at a crypto conference knows anything, needs to know anything about what the SEC is doing, because we'll have the framework in place. The pieces that are within our space will be within our space. Everyone will know that, but they won't spend all of their time talking about it because they'll just know how to comply. Obviously, there are always going to be facts and circumstances that are unique, and they'll be able to come to the SEC and talk to us about those facts and circumstances and get an answer about how to proceed. We don't provide legal advice, but we'll have that conversation. People who need to come in and register will be able to come in and register, but the regulatory issues just won't be topic number one on.
I think it'll have a tremendous economic influence on the industry as well, because it used to be that to come in and register was expensive, but at least there was like a fixed price for what it would cost to come in and register. Now, because registration is not an option for most companies that are active within the cryptosphere, they need to pay lawyers ridiculous amounts of money to kind of steer clear of the SEC. And there's really no fixed number for that, because it depends on what kind of products you're engaging with and what kind of exposure you want or don't want to have to US consumers. So I think that additional clarity is going to help foster innovation, in the sense that today you can't go and even start building a product without having to pay $100,000 to a lawyer to help set up a structure outside of the US, et cetera, et cetera. That's going to enable people to build lean and mean and get to a point where they want to come in and register, and then they could do that when they're hopefully in a more mature stage.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's such a great point, because the cost is not just the legal bills. It's the question of people are spending money designing their products and their projects to navigate this gray regulatory line. And I've talked to people who have wanted to build things, and they have a very concrete idea of what they want to build, and it's an interesting thing, but they can't build it because they don't know if they'd be tripping that securities line. And so the amount of wasted time, effort, energy is something that's very hard to measure. And as you say, you want to get to a point where the builders can build, and then when they get to a more mature point, when they're ready to hire those expensive lawyers and do an IPO or whatever it is they're trying to do, that they can do that or get their no action relief. They can do that, but it doesn't require them to spend their first $1 million on lawyers.
Yeah. And still not get a clear answer.
I mean, that's been the frustrating thing.
That's the most ridiculous thing.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, I hope that we get to a point soon where people feel comfortable interacting with the SEC, telling us what they think we need to be doing to get to that point where it's just a healthier relationship.
Amen. Thank you so much for your time. This was a real privilege for me.
The privilege was mine. Thanks for having me.
I again want to thank you for your service and for being a voice of reason. Can I ask you one more question before I let you go? I know we said 40 minutes, but this is something that's been sitting on me for a while. You are affectionately referred to as Cryptomom within the cryptosphere. Where did that come from?
That name came actually very early on, and I think it was 2018 when I wrote my first dissent on a Bitcoin ETP denial. That's when I got the name.
And it just it spurred up on social media, like people just started
Yeah, but then people get dissatisfied with me over the years, so I've morphed into crypto stepmom.
That okay. Thank you
But I
so
have to
much,
say
Hester.
that with that, never think of the government as your parent. You got to make your own decisions. You got to inform yourself. Don't rely on the government to be your mom or your dad.
Okay, well, we started with a disclaimer, and now we're finishing with one.
Finishing with a
Thank you
disclaimer.
so much.
Thanks very much.
Have a great 2025, and keep building.
You as well. Thanks so much. Take care. Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to Beyond the Code. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe, share with your friends, and to tune in again next week for more fun and insightful conversation.